Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I hope you're all enjoying your dinner. For those of you who have not opened your fortune cookie yet, I would like to update you with mine. If you wish good advice, consult your mother. Okay, so my mother may, bless her soul, 92 years old, and I hope she's with us for a long time. Anyway, so we're moving on to our evening program. I would first again like to thank our sponsors from the bottom of my heart. This event would not and could not be taking place, is not possible without the support of our sponsors and their generosity. And I hope there are some of our sponsors here enjoying our dinner. And of course, if they want a better dinner, we know how we can do that. But I'm only presenting the presenter. This is like the Oscars now. I'm going to present the person that's going to present the next person. And so I would like to present my colleague, Marcela Gomez, who has served in the past year as the chair of the program committee and has done the amazing job of creating the program that we're all experiencing. Marcela is the director of research analytics at the University of Pittsburgh. She is a graduate of the Universidad del Azuay in Cuenca, Ecuador, and has a master's and a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. I am inviting her to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Amit, for the introduction. Wow, it feels very different to be standing on this side of the room. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight Dr. Johannes Bauer. And it's definitely someone who doesn't need an introduction. But to those of you who don't know him, he is the Quello Chair in Media and Information Policy at Michigan State University. And since September 2023, he has been serving as a Chief Economist in the Office of Economics and Analytics at the Federal Communications Commission. His research focuses on designing policies, regulation, and other governance mechanisms needed to secure the full benefits of advanced information and communication technologies for society while mitigating their potential risks. So I won't take any more time, and I'll let our speaker join us. A round of applause, please.
Yeah, I know. Chocolate. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for that very warm welcome. I was really excited when Amit asked me to be the dinner keynote speaker. At that time, though, we didn't know that I would still be at the FCC. I was supposed to be back at Michigan State University and free to talk about the dead bodies in the closets and the file cabinets of the FCC. And now I'm a little bit more constrained. I had to run my talking points by the ethics office. It passed. But nobody can really check against delivery. No, but I mean, some of the things that I will say are probably will sound critical, but I want to assure I said it out of compassion for the role of government, for the role of the economists at the FCC, and to deepen the understanding of the conditions under which that work takes place. And create a deeper appreciation for how difficult it could be sometimes and how frustrating it sometimes can be. But I should emphasize that I speak as a professor at Michigan State University. I do not represent the Office of Economics and Analytics at the FCC or anybody else at the FCC. And I wanted to start by just sharing a few things how I got there. Right? And it was the holiday season. 2022, and I got a call from the FCC, but I would consider joining or at least being part of the group of people who were evaluated for the next chief economist position. And there was something very appealing about it, but also I had hesitations, right? For one, my own research agenda was already drifting in a different direction, more in the governance of emerging technologies and not necessarily more traditional telecom issues. But more importantly, I had done enough work with practitioners to know that there was a huge gap between the knowledge skills that academics have and the decisions that need to be made in a practical setting, like a regulatory agency. And I knew that the model would only work if people at the agency were willing to co-create, so to speak, right? That we could sort of kind of combine our knowledge and create synergies between the skills that I could bring to the table and the deep expert knowledge that they have. And I'm really privileged and honored to say, I mean, many of them are here, that I was welcomed by a team of colleagues that exactly was open to that kind of collaboration. They were welcoming, they were patient, they explained the same things 5 times to me because it didn't really sink in how the bureaucratic processes worked. And over time, I think we developed sort of in the projects that I was involved in, synergies that made me feel very comfortable. And you know, after the first half year, I felt like a boy lost in a forest, needing somebody to guide me. Now I have a little bit of a sense we can address projects and work productively on those. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Now, researchers have historically had an ambiguous relationship with government. And if you look at the research literature, there's many, many papers that are highly critical of government. More recently, perhaps it's fair to say that our attitudes are more open to government as a problem solver, right? There's more trust that government can and should solve problems. But it was not long ago, in fact, about 10 years ago, one of my predecessors at the FCC, when he was bantering with Tom Hazlett, I mean, I'm not sure whether he's still here, about the then open internet access proceeding, right? He said the FCC is an economics-free zone. And he meant it as a joke, essentially, right? Or as a shortcut for the fact that the FCC, or the economics used at the FCC was outdated, wrong, unsupported, irrelevant. But the Wall Street Journal picked it up and it has become a catchphrase in town. I mean, I've heard this phrase so many times from people who I didn't ask to share it with me. And I want to sort of correct that image, right? Because first of all, things have changed. The organization of economics at the FCC has changed. In 2018, under then Chairman Ajit Pai, the economics team was reorganized in one office. Before, they were distributed in different bureaus and offices. So there were economists in the media bureau, there were economists in the wireless communications bureau, in the wireline competition bureau. And the idea was that by bringing them all into one office, there would be synergies intellectually, there would be collaboration, there would be cross-fertilization, and a more effective team. And so since 2018, a little bit more than 5 years, the more than 100 people, most of them are economists, but also statisticians, lawyers, engineers, data scientists, now work in one office. And it's extremely busy. There's every year about 150 proceedings, reports, data collection efforts, consultations, and so forth come to this office. So time is always a challenge, right? I mean, it's the classical situation of an organization where the timeline becomes often the dominant factor, right? And there's a risk, and it's very difficult to counteract and manage that the urgent trumps the important, right? And but my approach when I got there, I thought, okay, first of all, the first mistake I have to avoid is I should not bring my own prior notions to my work there, right? I wanted to be as open as possible and sort of understand sort of how knowledge is being processed in the political environment, in which situations knowledge leads to productive outcomes that we can truly call in the public interest, and what the situations are when it doesn't work as well, and whether there's anything that could be done to change those later situations. And I mean, you know, all of us have probably an understanding of the situatedness of knowledge, right? It's embedded in social structures, in political structures, in power structures. And so I tried to bring that sort of that idea to the agency. And let me first start by giving you a few examples when knowledge was processed in a highly productive way and really led to outcomes that were in the public interest and welfare improving. Right? And I get really excited in the first case that I'm going to share with you. And how many times, I'm not sure how many economists say in here, but how many times have you seen a Pareto improvement? I mean, this is really rare that you see sort of solution that really leave everybody better off. I mean, often there's trade-offs, right? That we have to make distributional judgments and value judgments and so forth. But this seems like a small case. It's the case of Wi-Fi hotspots, right? And once you see the solutions, it's completely evident. But that's like most innovation is completely evident once you see it, right? I mean, the wheel, very evident once you see the wheel, but you first have to get there, right? And it can take a long time. And so in this particular case, the suggestion that was made by the economics team was to modify the budget constraint of the schools. Rather than giving them fixed numbers of hotspots they could procure, give them the flexibility to procure and bid prices down, right? And so the scenarios, the simulations that were run show that the improvements are in a 2-digit significant, very high range. So there's millions of dollars, probably even hundreds of millions of dollars that are being saved and that sort of enhance the contribution. And that was so compelling that it made it into the order and made it into the policy solution. Or another example. I don't think she's here, but several of you may have an interest in the unfairness of the charges that incarcerated persons pay for calls and video calls and so forth, right? And the FCC just recently closed the proceeding on incarcerated persons communication services. A mind-numbingly complicated exercise. So this is economics at the bottom level, I would say. It's sort of close to bean counting, accounting data, very difficult challenges in terms of the incompleteness of data, the processing of data, working with providers to really come to sort of accurate representations. But in the end, that team, after months and months and months of efforts, was able to come up with a proposal that passed the commission votes and really sort of significantly changes and improves the situation of incarcerated people and their families and everybody who is in those networks. Now, this is not to say that there were no political constraints, right? I mean, not everybody was happy with the first proposed solution, so you have to compromise. But there was a dialogue on those, right? And the pragmatic, reason-driven, data-driven argument prevailed. Third case, next generation 911 services. I'm not sure who has heard about next generation 911 services, right? And the idea is to use an IP-compatible system of emergency communications. And in addition to being able to share more information with emergency and rescue workers on let's say, the material composition of a site and the kind of whether there's toxic conditions and other things, you also can shave off seconds in response times, and those seconds in response time translate into billions of dollars of lives being saved, right? And thousands of lives being saved. And if you calculate, using sort of government statistics, right? I mean, it's an enormous value gain. Now, the challenge in this particular case was that the costs of investing in that system are actually very unevenly distributed. Right? And sort of small providers most likely are hit much harder than large providers. And the question is, how do you come up with a system of contracts and negotiations that would enable market-based transactions to address those issues? And again, the team using things like COES, the COES theorem, for example, highly sort of theoretical approaches in welfare economics and in contract theory to come up with a working model for this particular situation. Again, in a case where economists really contributed very nice. I should say that COES, by the way, also was at the FCC, although he took a sabbatical. I have to work. I'm on a paid contract. I'm an employed staff member there. Okay, I could go through a long list. Let me just mention one more because I see Evan Carell sitting back there with some other folks from OEA. And one of the huge success stories, and I think it really needs to be emphasized, that the FCC was able to pull off over 3 decades is the invention, the development, the implementation, the modification over the years of spectrum auctions, right, which in the meantime have been copied or emulated, I should say, perhaps worldwide, with great success. And initially, this was more a question of administrative efficiency to get spectrum to wireless providers faster than the prior methods, such as administrative assignments or beauty contests, if you wish, or lotteries that were used before. But it more recently has been used to repurpose spectrum. Right? We have very complicated issues to solve. How do you assign spectrum to uses that might be more valuable than sort of historical uses? And the team there came up with very ingenious solutions to address those issues and successfully conduct an auction that most people thought would actually not be possible, it would fail. And then most recently, new designs that are more efficient, that are more administratively slim have been developed. So there's a long history of success, and I could go on and on and on. If you want to read about those things, I should actually make an advertisement in our own interest. Since 2002, so for 22 years, the Review of Industrial Organization has published a special issue in December every year that contains survey articles from the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, and the British CMA, the Communication and Markets Authority, reporting on a few of the thorny cases that they dealt with. And so that's something worthwhile looking at. Now, what are the conditions? And this is my 1 year, small sample, one person observation analysis, right? It's also situated knowledge. It comes actually from a very privileged position because I'm not a career staff at the FCC, right? I mean, I'm there as a visitor that was embraced and welcomed. I have a tenured position, which is a very privileged sort of background, and so I can speak very easily. And I'm very much aware of this. But what I saw sort of as the conditions is a few things. I think they recur in all those cases that I mentioned. One is it was more of a bottom-up decision-making process, right? Expert staff were given agency to come up with innovative solutions, and agency leadership in a naturally hierarchical setting. Any bureaucracy is very hierarchically structured. We're willing to listen to those solutions and understand the compelling nature of those solutions, right? I mean, and so that's not always happening like this. Leadership, where political constraints, was willing to engage in dialogue rather than just present the staff as sort of specific policy cuts, as they're called, policy decisions, the sort of immutable constraints on what you can do. So I can give you, now let me go to a couple of examples where this didn't work as well. And I will not give you specific examples because they are in litigation currently, or they're currently pending. And my friends say, well, how do you do at the FCC? And then they say, wow, you're very involved in cases that might go to the Supreme Court. And say, I wish I could say this, right? I mean, I hope I leave a mark that is slightly, more influential than that. But here's sort of some of the scenarios where things didn't work well. And remember, this is from a compassionate perspective. One is, and in fact, I mean, I was listening to sessions today, other people talked about those. One is institutional inertia. And institutional inertia has multiple sources, right? One is, of course, the legal system. Common law, statutes, they often do not change as fast as we would want them to adapt. But I think there's another source of institutional inertia that's human habits, right? And habits of the mind, I think, is the biggest level of institutional inertia. And I think it's actually one that could be modified and could be changed, but that's very often in play. So we adopt the same solutions that we adopted 10 years ago, 20 years ago to a current problem. And I could give you many specific examples. So for example, when the question came up, how would we want to have speeds reported for broadband connections, right? Well, the 477 model was the providers submit the data. And one could have come up with a different model, but it was one that was we knew, right, from the past, but we knew actually also what the downsides were of that model, right? Nonetheless, it was put into the new data collection system. Second issue that is often in the way of such rational outcomes is time pressure, right? And they all interact, of course, right? I mean, if you're continuously under time pressure, maybe the time to do foundational thinking to address a complicated issue or to collect the data that you would need to answer it empirically is just not there, right? And then the default, of course, is the habitual behavior, right? You fall back to one another to compound each other. Thirdly, that's probably a really big one, top-down control. So regulatory agencies are by nature hierarchical, and US regulatory agencies are set up in an extremely hierarchical way. So the chairperson of the commission is the boss, and everybody works for that person, right? And so, but how that leadership role is enacted or implemented can vary very, very widely. And from the stories that people told me and that I've sort of seen from a distance before, and that I experience right now, right? There's very different leadership styles. There's inclusive leaders who invite discussion, even if they don't necessarily listen. But it's a difference, right? I mean, whether you're being heard, whether there's a critical dialogue on issues. So for example, a discussion on what policy options are available. I think economists actually have the most to say at that stage of a proceeding in some sense, right? I mean, what are the different options that we could adopt? And then they have a lot to say on what are the advantages and disadvantages if you choose for any one of those options. But the way, at least currently, from what I've seen, and you know, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that as I currently see it, it's a very top-down, tightly controlled agenda in many cases. Not always, as those success examples that I gave you before, but sometimes that's the case. And it's, you know, we see the same model currently at the Federal Trade Commission, and I commiserate sometimes with my colleagues at the FTC and the Department of Justice over coffee. And sometimes the top-down control is politically driven because there's sort of some political decision someplace that maybe, at least where I said, it's intransparent what it was that drove it, but it becomes an external constraint, something that you cannot question. And there could be sort of political cuts, policy cuts that of course are in the public interest, but I'm inclined to say they're rare. Generally, a decision would benefit from having the bottom-up process, you know, that listening to the experts, listening to different options and being informed in the process. But this is currently not often the case. Which leads me to another point, which actually interacts with this one, and that's the political environment in which an agency has to succeed. And I mean, I do not envy, you know, the FCC chairwoman. It's a complicated territory. It's often adversarial. There's lots of negativity that comes from the Hill or the circus that we call Congress, and it's difficult to navigate that space. So maybe to some degree that the top-down agency management style is influenced by the political environment, but it's not completely influenced. I think there would be more agency that is available that could be utilized. Finally, just let me say one more thing. This is because this is a group of researchers. It's the socio-technical systems that we want to control. They also create constraints, right? And the reality is that many of the more complicated policy decisions will create winners and losers. They're not like that Wi-Fi hotspot example where you can achieve a Pareto improvement and get all excited about it. They are creating winners and losers. And winners and losers in the American system that is highly decentralized and highly dynamic will go to the courts, they will go to the Congress people, they will start lobbying against the decision, right? And now you get administrative delays, court delays, stays of orders, and so forth. And the policy process is slowed down to a degree that also makes it very, very inefficient. Now, as I said, I mean, I'm looking at this from a very privileged decision. I mean, I think there's room to change those things, right? I mean, none of this is necessarily needed, but there's more agency at the level of leadership. There's more agency at the level of office leadership, although that's constrained obviously by what's happening on the top. And I think changing that leadership culture, changing the environment in which that leadership has to succeed would probably be an important thing. In the case of OEA, and we've had talks on and off about this, but I mean, I think one of the things that was overlooked when it was set up, there should have been a provision that OEA has to be consulted, must be consulted early on in the policy development process, right? Because once you have a separate office, everything is formalized, all the procedures are written down in detail. And I don't think it was overlooked maliciously or was not done maliciously. I think it was something that the lawyers didn't think about at this stage. So maybe there's hope that this could be changed. So let me just talk about a third issue quickly. I'm not even sure. I mean, I didn't look at my time. Give it a few more minutes. Okay. And that is, how can researchers contribute? Because I think those constraints can actually be modified by how we interact with the process, right? And so I think the most effective way how you could contribute is to submit your research or answers to questions to specific proceedings. Now that's time consuming, right? And those of you of us who live in an academic environment, we know that this is not honored generally in the university environment. It's nothing that you can build your tenure case on. And but it can be very, very effective. And there's a few people in the room. I mean, I don't want to sort of, but Scott is looking at me from there, right? So he's playing that. Of course, he has the benefit of having been at the FCC in the role for a couple of years, but he knows how to engage with the FCC. And so I can tell you that those submissions are studied. They're not, even if they don't show up in an order or in a report. Or John, for example, right? I mean, sitting right here in front of me. Same scenario, he was at the FCC too, so maybe there's a benefit from having that inside experience. But there's other research I can tell you from people in this room that we look at in the way of making decisions, even if it's not cited in the room, or even if your research is cited in a defensive way, right? Or it does influence the thinking process. It does influence the decision-making process. If you can't submit comments, the most effective comment is actually one that responds specifically to the questions asked in that proceeding. Right? I mean, often we get like a collection of 5 papers that are loosely related to a topic. Well, you look at them, but they really don't really move the decision very much. If you can't have the time, or don't have the time to submit, maybe a second best choice would be to simply share your work. I mean, OEA is a learning organization. That was very surprising to me to see how much internal learning there's going on. There's like weekly, bi-weekly talks with leading edge papers. I mean, Peter Crampton, who's sitting here, just presented earlier this week some really interesting papers. Others in the room presented. And that work is actually is received. It's discussed very intensely, and it informs our decisions. We also regularly bring in people just for informal conversations. Now, sometimes that is easy. Like maybe had people from Measurement Lab. There are several times we actually talked to Rosalind about a potential talk. Sometimes, you know, those topics interface too much as ongoing proceedings. So you get into what is called the ex parte space, right? Where you have to file a formal documentation of what's happening. The rules are more constrained. Lawyers may be sitting in the room. But nonetheless, these are all possibilities. And, you know, if you can do none of this, I would say keep doing what you're doing. Because research and knowledge actually diffuses in ways that is very often very indirect. And I mean, so again, coming back to that spectrum example, it took about 30 years from the first ideas that were articulated on the use of spectrum auctions to the time when Congress gave the FCC a spectrum authority. Or it took 15 years from the first FCC working papers on how to use spectrum auctions to the time they were implemented. And again, you cannot build your tenure case by saying, I will be relevant in 20 years. And it will not work. but knowledge does matter. So please do it. There's lots of topics that you could address. I mean, I'm not going to go into detail, but I mean, if you had anything to say on universal service, I mean, it's a topic that is stuck in inaction, but needs urgent attention. The FCC has started to spend time looking into issues of equity and efficiency. And a big initiative by the Biden government to look into equity issues in addition to efficiency issues. But there's very little foundational knowledge on how we can do it, very little data. There's a few people in the room who worked on those issues, and they really moved the needle, both theoretically and empirically. But way more needs to be done, and help from the outside community would be welcome. Evaluation, I mean, that would be a big issue, right? I mean, there's an enormous level of risk aversion, I think, in the FCC and other agencies, where you would rather not know whether your method worked than you would then know that it didn't work, right? Because that increases the political vulnerability, and then that environment comes into play. There's other things. Space policy. I was so happy to see topics on space policy here at TPRC, because there's a huge issue, right? I mean, there's enormous resource challenges. I mean, it's essentially a common property resource, but we have few governance principles for that resource. There's an enormous externality issue in terms of space debris. And there's very little work in the US or in other countries to look at this very systematically. So I was really happy to see that work. Finally, my pet project, right, is we need to have more understanding of how dynamic systems work. And a lot of our models are based on mechanical models, the equilibrium models, and a lot of things that happen in our space happen out of equilibrium. But far out of equilibrium. They're not marginal sort of deviations where we can trust that the forces of competition will pull us back to the equilibrium space. And I don't want to abandon the old models. They're useful workhorses if they're appropriate abstractions, but often they're not. And we need other tools in that direction. So keep doing what you're doing. The work is absolutely important. It is recognized, even if you don't see it in an order. And I can tell you it is of influence. So I encourage you to keep doing that good work, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. Do you want to do questions or something? Or we're out of time? Sure. Sure.
My question to you would be understanding all of the lessons you've learned and all of your opinions and experiences and how things went well and how things could go better. When you are no longer in this position, what do you hope your legacy or influence will be?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this too in the beginning, right? And it was actually one of the reasons why I had cold feet. You have this, as we live in this reputation-driven environment in the academy, which I have always fought as a department chair and in other ways, because it really is also in the way of high-quality research, if that's the main motivation. And so I decided I would actually not want to leave an impact, but I would like to contribute. And I was open to see whether, I mean, the folks at the OEA, they will tell you over a beer whether there was one, but that project of contributing succeeded. I mean, the only other thing that I would say is if somebody asks you, say yes, do it. I think it's a real important contribution. I mean, I learned so many things in terms of my own research perspective that I wouldn't probably have seen in another context, right? I mean, some of the internal proceedings, right? You have a hunch that that's how they work, but sort of seeing it on a daily basis and day in and out really makes a big difference. And it gave me a sort of a completely different appreciation for how difficult it is to change things, especially those where there's complicated stakeholder positions. I mean, let me just say a couple more things quickly about the research, right? Because there are a lot of submissions that are being made, and now there's the opportunity for me to step on everybody's toes here. And there is there's a lot of submissions that I wish had sort of used more rigorous research methods, right? I mean, there's a lot of submissions that essentially argue from belief systems. And I think it is related to this notion that the socio-technical systems we want to govern are complicated, right? They're ambiguous, they allow different interpretations, and they don't speak to us. I mean, if I let this paper go, right? I mean, there's gravity, we all agree gravity works, okay, and it pulls things down. But if you think about an issue such as how is net neutrality going to affect innovation, and then this is all I'm going to say about it. Don't worry. Okay, there is a wide range of papers, right, that you will find, and they don't come to different conclusions because they are right and others are wrong, but they come to different conclusions because they model the interaction of dynamic systems differently. And I'm not sure whether Jan Kramer is here, or Mark Bureau. I mean, they just did a really good paper in telecommunications policy. You should look it up. But they look at the question of interoperability. And they sort of look at this in a dynamic framework. And what they show is that interoperability will be beneficial in some situations, but it will not be beneficial in other situations, right? And all our regulatory models, and most of our regulatory models, are based on finding the best solution. But now you have to find a more differentiated solution, a different set of rules. And economists, those are involved in market design and other issues, and the folks who won Nobel Prizes on market design questions, including Milgram, they understand that this is the case. And I think what our task is to sort of translate some of those highly theoretical insights into sort of more practical rules that we can translate to regulatory rules on the ground. And I think the academic community really owes our colleagues in public service to contribute to those issues, right? And maybe there's a way to work with advocacy groups. And again, sometimes the arguments are essentially just bivariate correlations between numbers, right? And it's often the best we can do. But it, unfortunately, is not as rigorous as we would need it to really come up with good decisions, right? And then those submissions are also vulnerable. And one of the things that I didn't say in those top-down scenarios, one of the risks, and I was actually, Julia doesn't know this, but I was really close to saying I'm dropping the towel here, was once when the mission was essentially to justify something that had already been decided, right? And it was clear that some more additional analysis would have allowed to achieve a better policy without giving up any of the goals, right? But it was not possible to discuss any of that stuff, and I thought it's just I can't do this, right? just find reasons for things. But I don't want to close on this because I think the overarching theme is this. I mean, there's a set of skilled experts, and I mean, I would love to take a couple of you with me back to the university, and Julie says no. I mean, you'd be a fantastic research team, and but they work under conditions often that are not of their own making, right? Where sort of agency is limited, and sometimes the outcomes, like in those negative cases, the outcomes are undesirable, right? And so it's a challenge on higher level leadership and the larger political process to fix those things. And fortunately, there's many situations, and I could go on for a long time, where the work contributes to better policies in significant and meaningful ways, in tangible ways. And I think that should give us sort of a confidence that government can work, right? And I've always argued that good markets, working markets need enlightened government and enlightened rules. And I think that's what we all need to work on.
I said short question. I forgot to say short answer. Anyway, you still get the full chocolate tablets, so we're not being short on you. Thank you so much. And thank you all, and be here early in the morning. Okay, we'll see you. Good night.